I worked at Netflix, worked on a shoot for Netflix. That was with Brad Pitt as well, so that was quite an amazing start to my career. And then to go from that to then going to Extreme Sports Channel.
What were key values or metrics that you were looking for inside me or aspiring filmmakers or people that you onboarded as well? You know, like,
it was great when we worked with production companies and we could bounce these ideas off them, like you. And then you could be like, actually, you know what, it'd be amazing if we could get like a drone shot from this angle, or we could do something a bit different to make it a bit more dynamic and engaging, and to provide that knowledge about production that I might not necessarily have.
You then made the move to working for Canon. What kind of stuff did you do at Canon? I'm sure loads of people are working at, wondering, what do you actually do for them? Harry, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, man. You've got like a crazy long journey. We met many, many, many years ago, back when you were the client. So what I want to cover today and want to dive into is what it's like being client side and what you look for in a production company, how it was working for Canon and what you got up to there, and what ultimately ended up in you leaving Canon to and the reason behind that, to start your own business and go it alone, because obviously that seems like a pretty sought after nice job to have. So before we dive into it, we've got a lot to get into. Let's take it right back to the start of this process, which is pretty much actually when we met, and being kind of client side. So for people who don't know, give us kind of an insight into kind of like that role and your responsibilities, and then we can kind of discuss some valuable information around what might help these guys understand what agencies actually look for in production companies.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. I think, to start off, I worked for Extreme Sports Channel, and I was there for about 3.5 years. And I think that was my first sort of introduction into production. I was working as a creative executive at the time. I had a creative manager, and I was sort of dabbling in sort of graphic design work. But then we also, at the same time, Extreme was kind of going through this transition period where they were bringing on clients that needed more video work. And so the role became more of a sort of broader creative role, managing sort of content production as well as graphic design and lots of other aspects. And so then I got into a position where my manager actually then left, and then I became a more managerial role, and I was actually managing the productions for Extreme Sports Channel.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. And obviously that's where we worked together, because Extreme Sports were one of my sponsors when I was an athlete. And then when I made that transition into a filmmaker, they were kind enough to send work our way. And I was actually pointing out some of the photos that we've got up around the building as well. Have been from the shoots that we worked on together. And they were kind of like the big, holy crap moments where you're like, I can't believe I actually get to do this as a job.
It was pretty epic. I mean, to go from, because when I left university, I did a couple of internships. I worked at Netflix, worked on a shoot for Netflix in a biscuit factory in Bermondsey, of all places, which was really random. They had all these interior locations that were supposed to be based out in Afghanistan, but they were being done in this biscuit factory in Bermondsey. And then to go from doing that production, and that was with Brad Pitt as well, so that was quite an amazing start to my career. And then to go from that to then going to Extreme Sports Channel, to then sort of have a brief sort of moment away from production, and then to be introduced to it again, and then to work with you, because I know that was when you were obviously starting to get into production as well, was really, really interesting. And it sort of just developed from there. And then I got the opportunity to work with some incredible athletes around the world, and we worked on some amazing shoots together as well.
Yeah, exactly. And then I was very much starting out my journey when we worked together as well, and that was really cool, because it was kind of like we were all kind of figuring it out, and we had the flexibility with Extreme as well to really creatively think outside the box. Obviously, my background in action sports anyway lent itself nicely towards kind of like the mountain biking stuff that we did, and BMX stuff and all the rest of it. And I have a lot of kind of like real fond memories of those times, and it was a really good creative environment.
There were some good shoots.
It was, there really was. So what I want to know is, what ultimately were Extreme, in your experience? Of course, this has changed, we're talking quite a few years back, but ultimately I think the core elements around the setup being, right? So just to break this down, the setup being Extreme effectively would act as potentially a production company, or as a an agency or creative house. They would have their own clients that they would pitch video work to, or video ideas, etc., and then they would bring us on board to do that. So that's the process. So where they sit in that kind of, they get to select the production companies, the freelancers to work on these projects. What I want to know is what were key values or metrics that you were looking for inside me, or aspiring filmmakers, or people that you onboarded as well? What kind of things were important to a company like that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think at the time Extreme had just bought on their major client, which was Stanley Black & Decker. So that encompassed so many different tool companies.
They were cool.
They were cool though. From obviously Stanley Black & Decker, DeWalt, Mac Tools, and so many other different brands that fall under that umbrella company. And underneath those different brands, we obviously got assigned different projects and different productions to work on. And as you say, we were kind of working as like a creative in-house agency, but then whenever we had a project on, we would obviously outsource it to production teams. In terms of choosing production companies for different shoots, it came down to a matter of different things. I think it came down to whether or not the production company had experience in shooting action sports before, because obviously we're Extreme Sports Channel, everything that we were doing was extreme sports orientated. So I think a big part of us choosing a production company that had it came down to whether or not they had experience in shooting action sports before. Obviously, with you had such a big skiing background, being a GB athlete. We knew that you had a huge amount of insight into how to basically capture fast-paced action sports.
That you only get one opportunity to
You've got one shot. And also, if the athlete mucks up and you haven't got any footage, then obviously the whole production could be a disaster. So obviously, knowing that we could rely on people to capture that moment and make sure that we get the shot was really, really crucial. I think budget was also like a really big thing. And obviously, we were working with a very big corporation. It was a very big client, but obviously we were managing the whole marketing campaign. So the budget was split not just purely on content production, but across athlete sponsorship, events, and things like that. So we also had to keep in mind the budget as well was obviously a big part of who we would choose. But also, I think ultimately what it came down to me was quality. I think with any production that I wanted to do, I wanted to make sure that it was shot in quite a cinematic way. And I think that was something really, really important to me. And I didn't want to make something or make content that looked like just an action sports video. I wanted it to tell a story and to engage with audiences and also inspire them. I think that was the most important thing for me. So I think choosing production companies that had experience in those sort of areas was really important.
I think ultimately, to summarize kind of in one category, it comes down to just that track record, that proven ability to get the job done. And we see this time and time again. And that's actually interesting because I don't think that's something that's changed over time. I think that's still the same. I think it's still this the approach. These companies are taking a risk. It's their client, and they need to look after the client and get their best interests done. And they need someone that they know guaranteed can get the job done, and they're not going to be a nightmare to work with. And some previously on the podcast as well has kind of mentioned the same thing. It's just like kind of going with it, thinking outside the box, problem solving, being adaptable. And that leads to obviously, again, so much more work, but really building out that track record. Just to kind of give my 2 cents on that as well, because I think a lot of people might think, well, I don't have a track record. And I know that this is something that you've done in your own business that we'll kind of move on to, is that, well, those passion projects, there's nothing stopping you go into, if you want to do action sports, go into a skate park, go into XYZ to actually, actually build out your portfolio and track record of that as well.
So on that point, I think, as you say, people have the ability to go and create passion pieces for free, potentially, to try and build a portfolio. If they can get paid, fantastic. But I think certainly if you are someone that is dedicated to being able to prove yourself and create content, which in this example was related to action sports, but also shoot it in a very different way and a bit more dynamic, but also bring other creative ideas to the table. Obviously, me being a creative manager, I would always pitch ideas to Stanley Black & Decker about what I think we could do and come up with stories that I think would be really impactful and quite different. And I worked with the team in Extreme, and we all worked together and brainstormed ideas together. But ultimately, it was great when we worked with production companies and we could bounce these ideas off them, like you.
Yeah.
And then you could be like, actually, you know what, it'd be amazing if we could get like a drone shot from this angle, or we could do something a bit different to make it a bit more dynamic and engaging, and to provide that knowledge about production that I might not necessarily have covered myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like those agencies give you the platform to be able to do that. And actually, I think that's something that's more common now than it used to be, is the agencies actually bringing you on for your own creative ideas and kind of saying like, look, this is kind of like what we've prepped, but kind of what's possible from a production point of view as well. I released a video a while back about production we did with the Snow Centre, and said the same thing. We worked with their ads team to kind of like, the ads team wanted to go down this route, and they actually came up with the idea, and then we just said what was possible and what we could do from a creative point within the set parameters. And that's always the thing, isn't it? You know, when you think about these productions, it's, you've got, if there were no parameters and you had unlimited budget, unlimited time, how would you approach the project? And then with these restrictions or parameters on there, you know, time and budget and all the rest of it, then it's like, how would you reapproach that as well? And that's really good. So what is kind of like, what is a key piece of information that working client side for particularly in this case Extreme, because that was where we knew each other from, that has ultimately helped you become successful in running your own business? Because I feel like that's a really unique thing to be client side. You get such a unique insight to like, now running a business, you're like, I know what they want and I can just, you know, do this. So what's that thing that you've taken away that's really helped you?
Yeah, so part of my job that I mentioned earlier when I was at Extreme was to pitch ideas to clients like Stanley Black & Decker. So I learned a lot about the sort of pitching process and attended so many meetings when we were trying to onboard clients for Extreme as well. So I got a huge amount of experience in understanding about the treatment process and how to basically try and market yourself and get these clients. And also try and convince a massive corporation like Stanley Black & Decker that your ideas are going to really push their brand in front of audiences that they've never had the opportunity to present themselves to before.
Yeah.
So I think having that experience was really valuable. And like I said, working with the Extreme guys who, you know, some of them had huge amounts of experience in marketing, was great because it meant that I could learn off them and sort of enhance my skills and get experience with even just speaking with clients before actually going out and doing it for myself, my own business.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the things that you're always wanting to do when you're running your own business is obviously portray yourself in the best light. Everyone wants to do that. But if you haven't had the experience in terms of being able to talk to clients and being able to build that confidence to be able to do that, it's quite challenging to sort of come across in the right way when it's the first time you're doing it. And it's not a bad thing. I think anyone that's thinking about doing their business shouldn't see that as a barrier if they haven't got experience in working with clients. But I also do think it's quite valuable when you do work for another company, because you can use it as almost like a bit of a guinea pig. You can use it as that company as a stepping stone and a trial to where you want to be.
Yeah.
And so I think mainly from a business, marketing and onboarding client perspective, Extreme was incredibly valuable from that perspective. From a filming perspective, obviously, it was great because I was going on so many different shoots. I was working with so many different directors that had different styles and had lots of different approaches to how they do cinematography. Working with you, obviously, it was fantastic because I got to see how you shot, how you operated the camera, how you directed your crew. And then I worked with other directors as well in America and India who had other approaches as well. Yeah. And they sort of, by shadowing them, understanding how shooting works and how production works, that also helped me from a creative standpoint as well. So it kind of, working as a creative manager at Extreme, I got the whole package of being able to understand how business operates. And it was quite startup-y as well. So I kind of got that experience as well. I learned about how to market yourself and onboard clients and convince them that the ideas that you come up with are legit, but then also the creative aspect as well.
So just to kind of narrow that down into, the pitch process is probably pitching your ideas and getting that across in a way where the agency or the client understands that. What would be kind of, let's say, three things, let's say an aspiring videographer, they currently haven't pitched anything. They don't know how to kind of create a pitch deck. I remember that's something that was a big aha moment for me in my journey, was kind of like, oh, people actually pitch these ideas, and how do you bring it together? What would be kind of 3 tips for pulling together a pitch deck? And for people who don't know, a pitch deck is just a PDF document, maybe 5 or so pages that just kind of encompasses as a whole, the concept you're pitching, the problem it's solving, some kind of visual representation to showcase, whether that's a storyboard or mood board or images or whatever it is, or even inspiration from other bits of work. And then finally, a pricing thing is effectively a pitch deck, for those who don't know. What would be kind of like 3 tips for someone who hasn't done that before that you would advise them to think about when they're putting together a pitch deck, if they're going to pitch some of their ideas to a company?
Absolutely. So I think when you are creating a pitch deck, I think most of the time you've already spoken to the client. I think in my case, I usually have spoken to the client. I've got an understanding as to what they're looking for. What I tend to do is almost do like a response to brief, just to kind of prove that you've listened to them, you've proven that you've got that information, and you've basically presented it in your document. So for example, if they wanted one video, you literally state to create one video for client. Obviously, there's a lot more information that comes into that as well. But I think just having a slide just to prove that you've listened to what they want, and the following slides are basically going to answer that brief. It just proves that you've kind of taken on board what they're wanting. So that'd be my first tip. The second one, it depends sort of at what stage you're at. I think if you're at the early stages, you don't want a huge, massive deck, because I think a lot of clients might just sort of flick through and just not read absolutely everything. So as you say, maybe one slide gives a bit of a video synopsis as to what you want to create. A mood board as well is obviously really, really useful. And if you've got any imagery yourself that you can use to create the mood board, then that's even better, because then you can reference it and say that was all shot by you. But yeah, I would use stock imagery. I would use lots of other photo libraries to be able to populate that mood board with relevant imagery that I think is going to work with the film. And then finally, I think examples are obviously really important, video examples of the kind of style that you're looking for. But then I think, price is really important. But price is always a funny one, isn't it? And you've probably found this as well with your career, because 9 times out of 10, you'll go to a client and say to them, so what budget do you have? Yeah. And they will sort of say, oh, we haven't really thought about it, when they probably have. And then they're going to ask you, but could you just send over your costs and then we can make a decision from there? And you're suddenly thinking, well, now where do I go? Because it's a bit of a stab in the dark, isn't it?
And that's when your initial point of understanding your response to brief, understanding what they want. If you feel like you can't pull together a price, then you haven't asked enough questions to gain that understanding. So then you kind of go back to the question process to build that out. But
exactly.
It's still a shot in the dark, obviously, or a game of poker at the end of the day.
It really is, yeah. There's I don't think there's any sort of right or wrong answer with it, really. As you say, if you can get more information out of them at the early stages, then fantastic. But ultimately, it's a bit of a giving a range might be the best way of doing it.
and that's actually what we do now. So I have a go-to kind of sentence where if someone says they don't know what their budget is, I just say, okay, no problem at all. But like, are we talking about 1,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 or what? Where are we? Because we can do a video for 1,000 quid, but it's going to be a very different type of video to that for 10,000 or 100,000.
Yeah.
So it's like, give me some rough guide, and usually they will come back and they'll be like, we're probably thinking around, for instance, 20 to 50,000. And you're like, right, I know I'm in that I know I'm in that
In that
ballpark.
ballpark, yeah.
Very rarely they'll say, look, we just honestly have got no idea. That rings a little bit of a red flag to me, because that makes me feel like through the buying process, they're not really ready to buy yet. And how seriously are they taking this, or how valuable do they see this being? And actually, it's often those briefs that end up falling and never get done are those briefs where they just have no idea of how much it costs to have a video in the first place.
Yeah.
Or the other thing, like I said, we'll give them a slider. So we'll kind of be like, we've done, through our track record, we've done video A, B, and C. The video, this price for the video was 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, whatever. And then they can see a visual representation. We then go one step further underneath that, and we will then actually outline what went into that production. Because although video A at 5,000 might actually look better than the 15,000 one, but then you can document underneath it, like, that was one person for X amount of days. This was a team of people.
Managed to do it within half a day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I just thought that was kind of worth throwing in there as well, because that's something, and I learned a lot of this through Extreme as well. You know, they would often say like, we don't really have a budget in mind. Like, can you just kind of come up with something? And then we'd be like,
that was my fault.
How does this? Yeah, that's it.
I was being the difficult client.
Yeah, that's it.
But no, it's a classic dance, isn't it, between client and agency? It's always whenever it comes down to price, it's always going to be a difficult one.
But I also think from a creative, if you're clear with, like, you know, okay, shot in the dark, $5,000, but here's what we're gonna do, then the agency can kind of be like, okay, we get all of this for $5,000. Okay, our budget's only 1 or 2, so I assume we'll get roughly half. You know, so it's like, if you give them something tangible and you're not just giving them a random number, that makes sense totally. So now moving to kind of like the kind of a key point in your kind of career journey. You then made the move to working for Canon. What kind of stuff did you do at Canon? I'm sure loads of people are working at, wondering, what do you actually do for them?
Yeah, no, it was amazing actually. So I went from obviously being a creative manager at Extreme, mostly focusing on action sports and content within that sphere. Going to Canon was a completely different sort of kettle of fish, because it was basically entering into an area where you're covering so many different types of filmmaking. Because obviously when you create content for Canon, it's got to cover not just sport, but just absolutely anything, from wildlife to documentary to news broadcast to literally anything. And so going from that transition where I was working in a very niche industry to then working for Canon, where you pretty much could work on anything, was an amazing opportunity.
And you were working on the production side, or like anything kind of like specifically like a specific area? I don't know how their business is set up.
That's cool. Yeah, no worries. So I was a content operations specialist. I was working in a team of about 4 or 5 of us, and we were all given different projects to work on that covered Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So we would get given a product launch to work on. So for example, I worked on the C70 launch. So I would then manage the content creation for that launch that would be used by, in some cases, actually that was a worldwide launch. So in that example, my content actually got used by Canon USA, and not just Europe, Middle East, and Africa. It was used by lots of other territories as well. But basically what I would do, it was similar to Extreme. We would have a roster of agencies under Canon, production companies, that we would basically brief in. And then basically, usually we would sort of ask three or 5 agencies to basically pitch to us in response to the brief that we give them. So for example, the C70 launch, I approached quite a few production agencies, got all of their responses, and then I would pick the best one, and then I would present that to the business. And then basically, if the senior stakeholders said yes, we'd go ahead and capture the content.
Cool. Awesome. That's really nice. And you obviously mentioned you worked on the launch of the C70 and the R5C as well?
Yeah, the R5C.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. So it kept you busy.
It definitely did. Yeah. So when I first joined, I remember being given the EOS RA shoot, which was amazing. And to have that responsibility for, it's a pro camera. I don't think they sell it anymore because it was very niche. It was predominantly for astrophotography. And basically it's an EOS R, but it has an adapted sensor in it. So you basically can shoot astro. It basically picks out, without having to go into the tech and everything, it picks out infrared light. But basically what that meant was I got the opportunity to go to Sierra Nevada and capture astrophotography at this observatory called Carlo Alto in the middle of nowhere. And to have that sort of trust for my manager to go and create that content was incredible. And then, as time went on, I think 3 years later, I then ended up working on the C70 and R5C launches, which obviously those were the big launches. And actually the C70 was the first one I did where it was quite a substantial product launch. And I had worked on lots of other launches in the meantime. And obviously we had the COVID pandemic, which was just caused quite a few issues in terms of how we were able to create content. And obviously you probably found that as well.
Yeah, totally.
But with the C70, from my memory, we were sort of coming out of we were in and out of lockdown. I think we were in tears, but there were some restrictions of what we could and couldn't do. So it was a really interesting time trying to create this content for my first worldwide launch for the first RF cine camera in Canon's lineup. And the content was going to be used by the whole of Canon, basically. To have that sort of opportunity was absolutely incredible, and kept me very busy.
Well, that then leads me on to, it seems like the most sought after and ideal job. You get to travel the world. Your content's being used globally by Canon. You get to use all of their latest and newest unreleased camera gear. And you decide to leave and start your own business. Which, why?
I mean, basically, I think it goes back to what we were saying before about building your portfolio, and maybe when you're starting, potentially working for free and just to get your portfolio going. And I'd always, alongside my full-time job, I'd always created content outside of my job and done a few little side hustles here and there. So even when I was at Extreme, I did loads of content on the side, just creating bits and pieces. And I actually started my own production company. Well, I say started my own production company. I started the brand. I had a website, and I started that at the same time as when I was working at Extreme. So even before I moved to Canon, I had a company in mind. And I think when I moved to Canon, obviously I was there for 2.5, 3 years. I think over that time, I actually started creating so much content alongside that job that I was getting to the point with Canon where actually I was starting to turn down work outside of my job at Canon, like for my own business, that I sort of thought, well, actually, this just makes so much sense for me to go down this route, because if I'm starting to turn down work because I don't have enough holiday left to go and do it, or I can't shoot on weekends and that kind of thing. I just sort of thought it just felt like it was the right time to make that transition.
That's nice. I think if that's always been like your goal and your vision, regardless of kind of, anything else, you see this happen time and time again. I'm a huge believer in following what you're passionate about. That's getting filmmakers to make those first steps to start, a videography business of some kind, whether it's freelance or a production company, but actually doing what you love. And actually, we have so many opportunities, and that's so, I'm always inspired, and I always think it's amazing to kind of hear those stories, because, there's a lot of people doing a lot of jobs that they really don't want to do. And we get to wake up every day and do what we love, which is obviously like a huge selling factor, of course. But so it seems like always had this idea of production company in your mind. You kind of felt that actually your full-time job was kind of holding you back, and that's something that we kind of like hear.
I think with the job, it was an incredible job, as you say. And I got the opportunity to travel, and I did all these amazing different projects covering not just sports, but other things as well. And I tried to bring the extreme sports element into the Canon projects as well occasionally, just to mix things up a little bit. But I think ultimately, because I was very much involved in the creative still. I was very much involved in coming up with ideas and what we were going to do for the campaigns. But ultimately, I would always be onboarding a production company to come in, film it for me. I would be there on set, giving some direction. But ultimately, the production company were the ones that were executing the content. Those are the guys actually creating the content, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I was just managing it and overseeing it and just making sure that it basically hit all of our objectives and the benefits of the C70 and promoting it to the right audience. But ultimately what I wanted to do and what I loved doing was actually being the one creating. And I think that was possibly one of the reasons why I wanted to probably leave Canon to doing my own business, because I was shooting sometimes at Canon, but ultimately my job is more to be a managerial role. So it was more to kind of outsource that to different teams, whether that would be internal or external. That was the primary focus. So for me, it was like I've always wanted to work for myself. And well, that was when I realized that I wanted to work for myself and make that transition.
So in a moment, I want to get into kind of what advice you would have for aspiring filmmakers who kind of want to make that transition and potentially are struggling. But before we do, I want to know, what was it actually like going from full-time employment to becoming a full-time filmmaker? What did that actually kind of feel like? We're going to take this podcast over to our Perspective Pro group now. So if you have been enjoying it, make sure you go and check that out. I'll leave a link in the description below. We dive into how to create pitch treatments. We talk more about how to make that jump from full-time employment to full-time filmmaker, what it's like working at Canon, and what it was like working client side as well, and how Harry actually picked production companies for the projects that he worked on. The Perspective Pro group is an amazing platform, a community of like-minded people who are all dedicated to growing their videography businesses to that next level. We have monthly competitions with prizes worth hundreds of dollars. We've also got our forum, as well as daily video business tips, more expert features like this, and some exclusive content. So make sure you take a look. Hope you enjoyed this video. Until next time, peace.